The war between humans and the Valoran. Dominion had lasted 9 years. 9 years of fire, blood, and broken stations drifting through cold space. Millions had died on both sides, and neither species had gained enough ground to claim victory. The galaxy was tired. The soldiers were tired, and on the throne world of Afuz Prime, the youngest queen the Valoran had ever crowned was tired most of all. Queen Silithara Velkassan stood nearly 8 ft tall. Her exoskeleton was the color of dark amethyst, and her 4 eyes glowed faintly gold in the dim light of her private chamber. She was beautiful by her people's standards, sharp, angular, powerful, but tonight she looked worn. She had spent the last 6 hours arguing with her war council, and the result was always the same. More ships, more soldiers, more death, and for what? Border dispute that had spiraled into a full-scale war that neither side could win, not because she was weak, but because she was smart enough to see the truth. Her empire was breaking apart. From the inside, separatist factions were growing, colony worlds were running out of resources, her people were starving while her generals fed the war machine. Something had to change, and she decided it would start with her. She proposed a political marriage, a union between herself and a human, a living symbol of peace between two species that had spent nearly a decade trying to destroy each other. Her advisors were horrified. High Warden Kelvos, her most senior military commander, called it an act of surrender. But Silithara was the queen, and her word was law. Earth's diplomats agreed to the proposal. After weeks of quiet negotiation, they would send a candidate, someone suitable, someone respectable, someone who could represent humanity on the galactic stage. They sent Ethan Cole. He arrived on a small transport shuttle with a single bag and no escort. He was not tall by human standards, maybe 5'10". He had brown hair that was a little too long and a short beard that looked like he had trimmed it himself that morning. He wore a simple dark suit, not a military uniform. He had no medals pinned to his chest. He carried no weapons. He stepped off the shuttle, looked up at the massive crystalline spires of the Valoran capital, and said nothing. The welcoming party was enormous. Hundreds of Valoran nobles had gathered in the grand landing plaza, their iridescent exoskeletons gleaming under the pale twin suns. They towered over Ethan like ancient statues. Their mandibles clicked and whispered conversations as they studied the small humans standing alone on the platform. This was what Earth had sent them, this quiet, unremarkable man. High Warden Kelvas stood at the front of the crowd, his dark red exoskeleton marking him as a warrior caste noble. He was nearly 9 ft tall and carried himself like a blade. He looked down at Ethan with open contempt, his 4 eyes narrowing. This is their offering, Kelvas said to the noble beside him, loud enough for others to hear. A runt. They mock us. Ethan heard it. His expression did not change. He simply bowed in the Valiant fashion, left hand over the chest, head lowered, and waited to be led inside. Silithara watched the entire arrival from a viewing balcony high above the plaza. She had expected someone different, a general perhaps, a politician with a sharp tongue and a sharper smile, someone who would stride onto her world with confidence and make a show of strength. Instead, she watched a man who moved like he was trying not to take up too much space. She did not know what to make of him. The days before the wedding were filled with protocol and ceremony. Ethan attended every event without complaint. He sat through endless briefings on Valoran customs. He tasted unfamiliar food without hesitation. He allowed Valoran tailor to dress him in their formal robes which hung strangely on his smaller frame. He never once raised his voice, never demanded special treatment, never showed frustration. The court decided he was either very stupid or very broken, most assumed both, but Silithara noticed small things. During a formal dinner, a Valoran noble deliberately knocked a goblet toward Ethan to test his reflexes. Ethan caught it without looking, set it back on the table, and continued eating as if nothing had happened. At a garden reception, a young warrior stepped too close to Ethan in an aggressive display of dominance. Common Valoran challenge. Ethan simply looked up at the warrior calmly, held his gaze for 3 seconds, and then turned away. He did not flinch. He did not step back. He just chose not to engage. The warrior, unsure what to do with an opponent who showed no fear but also no aggression, eventually walked away confused. The wedding ceremony took place in the Hall of Resonance, a vast chamber carved from living crystal that hummed with a low, constant vibration. Thousands watched as Silithara and Ethan stood before the bonding altar. The ritual required an exchange of pheromone marks. Silithara pressed her scent glands gently against Ethan's wrists, marking him as her bonded partner. Then came the spoken vows. Silithara spoke, hers in the traditional High Valoran dialect, her voice clear and commanding. The court expected Ethan to speak through a translator. He did not. He opened his mouth and spoke in flawless High Valoran. The hall went completely silent. Even Kelvo stared. The dialect was ancient and complex. Most young Valoran could not speak it properly, yet this small, quiet human recited his vows without a single error, his pronunciation careful and respectful. His voice, usually so soft, filled the crystal chamber and resonated off the walls. It was the only time anyone had heard him speak above a murmur. When the vows were finished, Ethan fell silent again, and the court erupted in confused whispers. Who was this man? Why had he hidden this ability? What else was he hiding? That night in the quarters they now shared, Silithara stood on one side of the room and Ethan stood on the other. The space between them felt wider than the galaxy they were trying to hold together. She studied him, this strange small creature who had somehow learned her most sacred language and spoken it better than half her court. Why did you agree to this? She asked him directly. She was not a queen who wasted time with soft words. You are not a politician. You are not a soldier anymore. You have no ambition that I can see, so why are you here? Ethan was quiet for a long time. He looked out the window at the alien sky, at the 2 pale moons hanging low over the crystal city. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, because someone had to. Silithara waited for more, an explanation, a philosophy, a hidden agenda, but Ethan simply turned, wished her a good night, and lay down on the far side of the bed with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. She stood there in the silence watching him and realized for the first time that she could not read this man at all, and that more than anything made her uneasy. 3 weeks after the wedding, the Valian court had already made up its mind about Ethan Cole. He was furniture, a decoration, a political prop that Earth had shipped across the stars and left on the queen's doorstep like an unwanted gift. He wandered the palace hallways like a ghost, never speaking unless spoken to, never drawing attention, never demanding anything. The servants barely noticed him. The nobles pretended he did not exist. Even the guards, who were trained to track every living creature in the palace, sometimes forgot he was there. That was exactly how Ethan wanted it. Silithara, however, could not stop watching him. It bothered her in a way she could not fully explain. She was a queen. She had been trained since birth to read people, to sense ambition, fear, loyalty, and deception in the way person stood, breathed, or moved there. Eyes, every being she had ever met, revealed themselves eventually, but Ethan gave her nothing. He was a closed door in a palace full of open windows, and it drove her quietly mad. She began to notice patterns. Ethan always sat with his back to a wall. He always chose seats that gave him a clear view of every entrance and exit. When they walked together through the palace corridors, a rare occasion, usually for some public appearance, he always positioned himself on her left side, slightly behind her, placing his body between her and any doorway they passed. When she stopped, he stopped. When she moved, he moved. It was subtle, almost invisible, but once she saw it, she could not unsee it. One evening she tested him. She deliberately walked toward a corridor that she knew was under construction, where a section of wall had been removed and replaced with temporary scaffolding. It created a blind spot, a place where someone could hide unseen. As they approached, Ethan's pace changed. It was barely noticeable, a slight shortening of his stride, and he shifted his position so that he was now between her and the open wall section. His right hand, which had been hanging loosely at his side, moved to rest near his belt. He did not look at the gap. He did not tense visibly, but he was ready. They passed without incident. Silithara said nothing, but she filed the observation away. Old habits, Ethan said that night when she finally asked him about it. He gave her that half smile of his, the one that never quite reached his eyes. I spent a long time in places where you had to watch the doors. She wanted to ask more, but he changed the subject with a quiet question about a flower he had seen in the garden, and the moment passed. It was the Terran ambassador, Nora Castillo, who eventually gave Silithara the pieces she was missing. Nora was a sharp woman in her 50s with gray stray hair and the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades navigating alien politics. She had known Ethan before the marriage arrangement, though she admitted they were not close. He was a combat medic, Nora told Silithara during a private meeting. Served on the front lines during the worst of the war. He was stationed at Caldera Station when it fell. Silithara knew about Caldera. Every Valian did. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the war, a human station that had been besieged for 11 days before it collapsed. Thousands had died. Ethan was in the lower tunnels when the upper decks were destroyed. Nora continued. The main evacuation routes were gone. He found 19 wounded soldiers trapped in a collapsed section and carried them one by one through 2 kilometers of broken tunnels to a secondary extraction point. The tunnels were unstable. There was no light. Enemy patrols were sweeping the area. It took him 14 hours. Silithara said nothing. She waited. He saved all 19, Nora said. Every single one, but the mission was classified because of the intelligence. Assets involved, so he never received any public recognition, no medal, no ceremony. After the ceasefire, he requested the quietest posting the Terran coalition could give him. He wanted to disappear, and instead we put him on a throne. Silithara murmured. He volunteered. Nora said, when the marriage proposal came through, nobody wanted it. The diplomats thought it was a trap. The military thought it was pointless. Ethan walked into the office, signed the paperwork, and left without saying a word. Silithara sat with that knowledge. For days, she watched Ethan differently. Now not as a curiosity, but as a puzzle she was slowly beginning to solve. She saw the way he noticed everything, the way he counted guards during shift changes, the way he studied the layout of every room he entered. He was not a ghost, he was a sentinel, and he had been standing watch since the moment he arrived, but the court still saw nothing. To them, Ethan was a joke, and no one made that joke louder than High Warden Kelvos. It happened at the Grand Unity Banquet, a formal event meant to celebrate the 1-month anniversary of the marriage. Hundreds of nobles filled the great dining hall. Kelvos, who had been drinking fermented nectar since the afternoon, stood up during the entertainment portion and made an announcement. Let us see what our queen's pet can do, he said, his voice booming across the hall. The humans claim to be strong. Let us test that claim. He gestured, and a massive Valoran warrior stepped forward from the crowd. The warrior was from the Blade Caste, nearly 9 ft tall, with 4 arms and an exoskeleton thick enough to stop a bullet. He cracked his mandibles in a grin and looked down at Ethan, who was still sitting calmly at the royal table. Stand, human, Kellas ordered. Show us the strength of your species. The hall went quiet. Every eye turned to Ethan. He set down his fork. He wiped his mouth with a cloth. Then he looked up at Kelvas, looked at the warrior, and looked back at Kelvas. No, he said simply. The hall erupted in laughter. Kelvas spread his arms wide, playing to the crowd. You see, this is what humanity offers, a creature that cannot even stand when challenged, weak, soft, pathetic. The laughter grew louder. Some nobles pounded the tables. The warriors sneered and turned away, shaking his massive head. Through all of it, Ethan sat perfectly still. His hands rested on the table, relaxed. His breathing was even. His eyes were steady. He was not embarrassed. He was not afraid. He was simply choosing not to react, and that choice was so deliberate, so controlled, that it was almost unsettling if anyone had bothered to look closely enough. Silithara looked closely enough. She saw what was behind his calm expression, and it was not submission, it was patience. The kind of patience that a man learns when he has spent 14 hours crawling through dark tunnels with dying soldiers on his back. The kind of patience that says, I could act, but I am choosing not to, and that choice is the strongest thing in this room. After the banquet, she found him in their quarters. He was standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. They think you are nothing, she said, and there was an edge to her voice, not anger at him, but anger on his behalf, which surprised her. The twin moons cast pale light across his face, and for a moment she thought she saw the ghost of something old and heavy behind his eyes. Good, he said quietly. Let them, he said. Nothing more. And Silithara, who had spent her entire life surrounded by beings who never stopped talking about How powerful they were stood in the silence of this strange, quiet man and felt something she had not expected. She felt safe. The bomb started 6 weeks after the wedding. The first one hit a supply depot on a colony world called Varith Minor. The second destroyed a civilian transport carrying 300 Valiant workers between stations. The third was Boulder, a chemical device detonated inside a government building on a fuse prime itself, just 4 miles from the palace. 17 people died. Among them were 2 children. The Ashbourne Pact claimed responsibility for all 3 attacks. They were a separatist faction that had existed for decades but had always been small and disorganized. Now suddenly they had funding, they had weapons, they had soldiers, and they had a message that was spreading like fire. Through the Valoran colonies, the peace treaty with humanity was a betrayal. The Queen was a traitor. And the human living in the palace was proof that their species had already been conquered. Silithara's grip on power was slipping. She could feel it in the way. Her advisors hesitated before speaking. She could see it in the empty seats at council meetings. Nobles who had quietly stopped showing up. She could hear it in the whispers that followed her through the palace corridors. And standing behind every whisper, tall and sharp and patient as a blade, was High Warden Calvas. He had not officially joined the Ashbourne Pact. He was too smart for that, but he did not condemn them either. In public he expressed deep concern about the attacks while simultaneously calling for the dissolution of the marriage and the resumption of military operations against Earth. He gave speeches about valor and purity and the sacred duty to protect their species from contamination. He never said Silithar's name. He did not need to. Everyone understood. Through all of this, Ethan Cole remained invisible. He attended no council meetings. He made no public statements. He did not appear on any broadcasts. As far as the Empire was concerned, the Queen's human husband had vanished into the background of the palace like a piece of forgotten furniture. But Ethan had not vanished. He had simply gone somewhere no one thought to look down. The lower levels of the palace were home to the Velith, the lowest caste of Valoran society. They were the workers, the cleaners, the maintenance crews. They fixed the pipes, scrubbed the floors, cooked the food, and kept the palace running. In return, they were ignored. Nobles spoke to them. No physician treated them. They lived in cramped quarters beneath the crystal towers, and they had lived that way for centuries. Ethan started visiting the lower levels during his second week at the palace. At first the Velith were terrified of him, a human in their quarters. It had to be a mistake, or worse, a test, but Ethan kept coming back. He sat in their common rooms and listened to them talk. He learned their names. He asked about their families, their work, their problems. He spoke slowly and carefully, using the simple Valoran dialect they preferred, not the high court language. Within a month he was one of them. He fixed a broken water filtration unit in the eastern lower wing using tools borrowed from a maintenance closet and knowledge he had gained from years of keeping field equipment running in war zones. He patched a leaking coolant line that the palace engineers had ignored for 6 months when a young Velith girl named Tavi developed an infected wound on her arm, a cut from a sharp piece of broken pipe, and no physician would come to the lower levels to treat her. Ethan cleaned the wound himself, applied a makeshift bandage using materials from the kitchen, and sat with her until the swelling went down. Tavi's mother, a quiet woman named Kessa, watched the human tend to her daughter with an expression that moved slowly from suspicion to confusion to something that might have been gratitude. When Ethan finished, Kessa touched his hand lightly, a Valoran gesture of deep thanks usually reserved for family, and Ethan simply nodded and told her to keep the wound clean. Words spread through the Veleth community with the quiet speed of people who had learned long ago that whispering was safer than shouting. The Queen's human was kind. The Queen's human treated them like they mattered. Silithara found out about Ethan's visits almost by accident. A Veleth servant accidentally mentioned the human's kindness while cleaning the royal chambers, and then froze in terror, thinking she had spoken out of turn. Silithara pressed her gently for details and learned everything: the water filter, the coolant line, the little girl with the infected arm. She did not know how to feel about it. In Valoran culture, associating with the Veleth was considered degrading. A queen's consort spending time in the lower levels would be seen as proof that humans had no understanding of proper social order. Kelvos would use it as ammunition, and yet Silithara could not bring herself to tell Ethan to stop, because she understood, even if she could not yet say it out loud, that what he was doing was not foolish, and decency had been in short supply in her palace for a very long time. The crisis came on a cold afternoon when Nora Castillo's diplomatic shuttle was attacked by Ashbourne agents while traveling to a peace summit on a neighboring world. The shuttle was hit by a pulse charge that disabled its engines and sent it crashing into the outskirts of the capital city. Nora survived the impact, but barely. She had shrapnel wounds across her torso, collapsed lump, and internal bleeding that was killing her slowly. By the time the palace medical team reached the crash site, Ethan was already there. No one knew how he had gotten to the wreckage so fast. No one had seen him leave the palace, but when the rescue team arrived, they found Ethan kneeling beside Nora in the twisted remains of the shuttle, his sleeves rolled up and his hands covered in blood. He had already stopped the worst of the bleeding using strips of his own shirt as compression bandages. He had improvised a chest seal from a piece of the shuttle's interior lining to stabilize her collapsed lung. He was calmly talking to Nora, keeping her conscious, his voice low and steady as he worked. Silithara arrived minutes later with her personal guard. She pushed through the crowd of soldiers and medics and found Ethan still working. The Valian physicians hesitated. They were trained in Valian physiology, not human. They did not know where to begin. Ethan looked up at them and, in fluent medical, began giving them instructions. He described human anatomy using Valoran reference points. He told them which instruments to use and where to cut. He guided them through the surgery like a man who had done this 100 times before, because he had. The Valoran physicians later admitted that without Ethan's intervention in those first critical minutes, she would have died at the crash site. Silithara stood at the edge of the medical bay afterward and watched Ethan wash the blood from his hands. His face was calm, his breathing was even, his hands, which had just saved a woman's life with nothing but torn cloth and improvised tools, were perfectly steady. There was no trembling, no adrenaline. Shaking, no dramatic collapse of relief. He simply washed his hands, dried them, and asked one of the nurses if Nora was comfortable. In that moment, Silithara understood. Something about Ethan that she had been circling for weeks. His silence was not emptiness, it was not damage, it was not weakness, it was the stillness of a man who had already lived through the worst things the universe could throw at a person and had come out the other side with one simple, unshakable conviction that when things fall apart, you do not scream, you do not freeze, you move, you help, you keep going. She walked over to him and stood close enough that their arms almost touched. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw that his eyes were tired, not broken, just tired. The kind of tired that lives in the bones of people who have spent too many years carrying others. Thank you, she said. He gave her that half smile. She is my friend, he said simply. Silithara nodded, and then, without thinking about it too carefully, she reached out and took his hand. His fingers were rough and scarred. They were the hands of a healer, a builder, a man who had spent his life putting broken things back together. He did not pull away. They stood like that for a moment in the quiet of the medical bay, and something between them shifted, not dramatically, not with fireworks or grand declarations, just a small, quiet turn, like a key finding its lock. Outside the palace walls, the Ashper Pact was growing stronger. Kelvos was making his final preparations. The storm was coming, but inside that small, still moment, something else was growing too. And it was stronger than any storm. The coup came on the night of the hollow eclipse, when both moons of Athas Prime passed behind the planet, and the sky went completely dark. It was the most sacred night in the Valoran calendar, time of silence and reflection, when the Queen's personal guard traditionally stood down from active duty to join the rest of the empire in ritual meditation. For one night, the palace was unguarded. It had been that way for 1,000 years, and no one had ever broken the tradition. Kelvos had been counting on exactly that. The first explosion hit the eastern gate at midnight. The second took out the communications tower. 3 seconds later, the third collapsed the bridge connecting the palace to the Loyalist military barracks across the river. In less than 30 seconds, the palace was cut off, blind and surrounded. Ashburn soldiers poured through the breached eastern gate in disciplined waves. They wore black armor, stripped of all insignia, and they moved with the coordination of troops who had rehearsed this assault many times. They swept through the lower corridors, the servant quarters, and the administrative wings, sealing every exit as they went. The few guards who had remained on duty were overwhelmed within minutes. Silithara was in her private chambers when the first explosion shook the walls. She was on her feet instantly, years of royal combat training taking over. She grabbed the ceremonial blade that hung beside her bed, a weapon that was old but still sharp, and moved toward the door. Her 2 remaining bodyguards, loyal warriors who had refused to observe the meditation, flanked her as they made their way toward the throne room. They did not make it far. Ashbourne soldiers were already in the corridors, and after a brief, vicious fight, her bodyguards were down. Silatha fought alone for nearly a minute, her blade cutting through 2 attackers before a third struck her across the back with a pulse baton. She fell to her knees, pain screaming through her exoskeleton, and was dragged into the throne room. Kelvos was waiting for her. He stood at the center of the hall, surrounded by 40 armed soldiers and a dozen nobles who had sided with the Ashbourne Pact. He had removed his warden's cloak and replaced it with the black and silver armor of the separatists. He looked like he had been born for this moment. His 4 eyes burned with a cold, satisfied light. Silara, he said, dropping her title deliberately. You have weakened this empire beyond repair. You married vermin. You invited contamination into our bloodline. You abandoned the warrior traditions that built our civilization. Tonight I correct your mistakes. Silthera spat blood onto the crystal floor and looked up at him. You are a traitor, Kelvas. The empire will not follow you, Kelvas said, and when they find your body in the body of your human pet, and when they learn that it was Earth's agents who assassinated you during the sacred eclipse, they will follow me straight back to war. Silithara's blood went cold. That was his plan. Kill her, kill Ethan, blame the humans and reignite the war. It was elegant in its cruelty, and it would work. Where is he? She asked, hating that the question revealed how much she cared. Kelvos smiled, his mandibles clicking. Amusement. Your human probably hiding under a bed somewhere. My soldiers will find him soon enough, but I wanted you to watch the throne change hands before you die. He turned to address the assembled nobles, raising his arms. Triumph. That was when the lights went out, not gradually, not with a flicker. Every light in the throne room, every crystal lamp, every glowing panel, every emergency beacon, all of it died at once, plunging the massive chamber into absolute darkness. The Ashbourne soldiers activated their helmet lamps immediately, but something was wrong with the palace's systems. The environmental controls had shifted. Low hum filled the air and the temperature dropped sharply. Frost began forming on the crystal walls. What is happening? Kelvas barked. No one answered, because in the lower levels of the palace, in the maintenance tunnels and service corridors that no soldier had thought to secure and no noble had ever bothered to learn, something was already moving. Ethan had not been hiding. He had not been asleep. He had not been caught off guard, because Ethan Cole had spent the last 2 months doing what he did best, watching, listening, and preparing for the moment when everything went wrong. Not the exact date, not the exact plan, but he had felt it building the way a medic feels infection spreading beneath the skin, the troop movements that did not match official schedules, the supply shipments that disappeared from the logs, the way certain guards looked at Silithara with something other than loyalty. He had mapped every corridor. The palace, he had memorized every security rotation. He had identified every structural weakness, every blind spot, every choke point. He had done all of this quietly, patiently, without telling anyone, because telling people would have meant trusting systems that were already compromised. When the first explosion hit, Ethan was already in the lower levels with the Velith. They were terrified. The sounds of combat echoed through the walls, and many of them had children. Ethan moved through their quarters calmly, speaking in a low voice, organizing them with the quiet efficiency of a man who had managed chaos before. He gathered the maintenance workers, the ones who knew the tunnels better than anyone in the palace, and gave them a plan. It was a simple plan, because simple plans work when everything else is falling apart. The Velith knew every Pipe every conduit, every hidden passage in the palace, they knew where. The power junctions were, they knew. Which doors could be sealed manually. They knew how to move through the building without ever setting foot in a main corridor. Ethan organized them into teams. One team sealed the critical choke points, trapping groups of Ashborn soldiers in dead-end corridors. Another team disabled the communication jammers that Kelvos had planted to block signals to the loyalist forces outside the city. A third team opened the old service tunnels that connected the palace to the river barracks, tunnels that had been sealed for decades and that Kelvos did not even know existed. Within 20 minutes, the loyalist forces outside the capital received a signal. Within 30, they were mobilizing, but Ethan did not wait for them. He walked into the throne room alone. Emergency lights had come back on at a dim level, casting the chamber in a cold blue glow. Kelvos stood in the center, surrounded by his soldiers with Silithara on her knees before him, when the main door opened and Ethan's silhouette appeared in the frame. The room turned to look. For a moment, nobody moved. The quiet human, the pet, the joke of the Valoran court. He stood in the doorway with no weapon, no armor, and no expression on his face. He looked exactly the same as he always did, calm, unremarkable, and completely unafraid. It was a genuine laugh, full of disbelief and delight. You came to die with your queen, how romantic. He waved his hand at the blade cast warrior beside him, the same champion from the banquet, the one Ethan had refused to fight weeks ago. Kill it, Kelvos said casually. The warrior stepped forward. He was enormous, 4 arms, each one thicker than Ethan's torso. His exoskeleton was scarred from dozens of fights. He cracked his mandibles in a predatory grin and lunged. What happened next lasted 8 seconds. Ethan did not fight like a soldier. He fought like a surgeon. He sidestepped the first strike by inches, not feet, inches, letting the warrior's momentum carry him past. He targeted the joints, the places where the exoskeleton was thinnest, the nerve clusters that Valoran anatomy texts described and that Ethan had studied late at night in the palace library. While the court slept, the warrior's primary right arm dislocated at the shoulder. A 4th strike to the inside of the upper knee joint buckled his leg. Ethan caught the warrior's secondary arm as it swung wildly, twisted it against the joint's natural rotation and forced a massive body downward. The warrior hit the crystal floor with a sound like a tree falling, and Ethan stepped back. He had not killed the warrior. He had not needed to. The throne room was silent. 40 armed soldiers stared at the small human standing over the broken body of their best fighter. Kelvos' smile was gone. For the first time, something that looked like uncertainty crossed his face. Ethan looked directly at him and spoke clearly, his voice carrying through the hall the way it had on his wedding day. You surrounded yourself with soldiers, Ethan said. She surrounded herself with people. That is why you lose. Behind the throne room, the sealed doors groaned and then burst open. Loyalist forces poured in through the old service tunnels, led by Velith guides who knew every step of the way. The Ashborn soldiers, already scattered and confused by the chaos in the corridors, were overwhelmed in minutes. Kelvos drew his weapon but was surrounded before he could use it. He was taken alive, snarling and cursing, dragged from the throne room by soldiers who had once served under him. Silithara rose slowly from her knees. Her body ached, there was blood on her face and cracks in her exoskeleton. But she was alive and her throne was. Still standing, she looked across the room at Ethan. He was breathing hard. There was a bruise forming on his forearm where he had blocked one of the warrior strikes. His hands were shaking. Now just slightly, the adrenaline finally catching up to the calm. He met her eyes and gave her that half smile. And Silithara Velkassan, queen of the Valoran Dominion, ruler of 47 worlds, who had never bowed to any living creature, felt something crack open inside her chest that was not pain. The days after the coup were loud. The Valian Dominion had not seen a political upheaval of this scale in over 3 centuries, and every corner of the empire was buzzing with news, fear, and questions. Kelvas and 17 high-ranking members of the Ashbourne Pact were taken to the deep vaults beneath the Hall of Justice to await trial. The nobles who had sided with them were stripped of their titles and their estates were seized. Military units across the empire were investigated for Ashbourne sympathies. Some commanders surrendered willingly, others had to be removed by force. Silithara moved through the crisis with the sharp precision she had been trained for since childhood. She addressed her empire from the rebuilt communications tower, her voice steady and her words careful. She did not call for vengeance. She did not rage against the traitors. She simply told the truth, that a faction within her own court had tried to murder their queen and restart a war that would have destroyed them, and that they had failed because ordinary people had chosen to stand against them. She did not name Ethan in that broadcast, not because she wanted to hide his role, but because she already knew that he would not want to be named. And she was right. The galactic press descended on Athens Prime within hours. Human and alien journalists crowded the capital, desperate for interviews, images, and details about the human who had single-handedly dismantled a palace coup. The story was everywhere. Networks called him the silent consort. Opinion writers debated whether he was a secret intelligence agent. Military analysts studied the throne room footage captured by the palace's internal security systems and published frame by frame breakdowns of the 8-second fight. Ethan's precise clinical takedown of a warrior twice his size became the most viewed clip on the Galactic Network for 3 weeks straight. Ethan declined every interview request, every single one. He did not appear on any broadcast. He did not release a statement. He did not pose for photographs when a particularly aggressive journalist managed to find him in the palace garden and thrust a recording device in his face. Ethan simply looked at him, said, "No, thank you," and went back to watering a plant. The journalist stood there for a full minute waiting for more, before realizing that there was no more. That was it. That was the man who had saved the Valian Empire, and he was watering a plant. Life in the palace slowly returned to something like normal, but the shape of that normal had changed. The Velith, who had been invisible for centuries, were suddenly visible. Their role in the coup's defeat could not be ignored. They had sealed the corridors, they had opened the tunnels, they had guided the loyalist soldiers through the dark while the nobles hid in their chambers. Without them, Kelvas would have won, and everyone knew it. Silithara announced reforms. Within the first week, the Velith would be granted citizenship rights that had been denied to them for generations. They would have access to medical care, education, and legal protection. There, children would be allowed to attend the same schools as every other Valoran. It was not everything. Centuries of inequality could not be erased by a single decree, but it was a beginning. When her advisors questioned the timing, worried that the reforms would be seen as weakness, Silithara told them about the water filtration unit. She told them about the coolant line. She told them about little Tavi and her infected arm. She told them about a human who had walked into the lowest part of the palace and treated the people there like they mattered, and how those same people had risen up to save the throne when every noble and general had failed. If that is weakness, she said, then we have been confusing strength with noise for a very long time. The advisors had no answer for that. In the weeks that followed, Silithara found herself seeking out Ethan's company more and more, not for political strategy or public appearances, but simply because she wanted to be near him. She discovered small things about him that no one else knew. He hummed Old Earth songs when he thought he was alone. He was fascinated by valiant insects and could spend an hour watching a single one move through the garden. He read voraciously, working his way through the palace library at a pace that impressed even the scholars. He had a scar on his left shoulder from a piece of shrapnel that the field surgeons had never fully removed, and on cold nights it ached. Though he never complained about it, she discovered that he was funny in a quiet, dry way that caught her off guard. He made observations about Valian court politics that were so accurate and so gently absurd that she sometimes laughed before she could stop herself, a sound that her attendants had never heard their queen make, and she discovered that he was kind, not kind in the way politicians are kind, where every gesture is calculated for maximum effect, kind in the way that people are kind when they are not performing for anyone. He remembered the names of every Velith worker in the lower levels. He asked the palace cooks about their families. He noticed when a guard was having a bad day and would leave a cup of Valian tea at their station without saying a word. He moved through the world as though every person he met was worth his time because he believed they were. One evening she found him on the western balcony. It was his favorite spot, a quiet alcove overlooking the capital city where the crystal towers caught the light of the twin moons and scattered it across the sky in pale, fractured rainbows. He was leaning against the railing, watching the city below, and he looked more peaceful than she had ever seen him. She stood beside him, not across from him, not above him, on her throne, beside him like an equal, which was something she had never done with anyone. My people called you weak, she said. They looked at your silence and your small frame, and they decided that you had nothing to offer. They thought you were empty. Ethan did not respond immediately. He watched the moons rise, their pale light washing over his face, and when he spoke, his voice was the same quiet murmur she had come to know so well. Where I come from, he said, the loudest person in the room is usually the most afraid. Silithara considered that. She thought about Kelvos and his booming speeches, his grand displays, his need to dominate every space he entered. She thought about the Ashbourne and their bombs and their slogans and their furious certainty, and she thought about Ethan, who had walked into a room full of armed soldiers with nothing but his hands and His comment had changed everything. "I have a question," she said. "It has been keeping me awake since that night. Ask it. You could have let it happen. Ku, you had no obligation to fight for this empire. You are human. This is not your world. This is not your war. Calvos was not your enemy. You could have found a way out of the palace during the chaos and gone home. No one would have blamed you." She paused. "Why did you fight?" Ethan was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the balcony, carrying the sweet alien scent of Valian night. Flowers below them, the city hummed with life, thousands of people going about their evenings, unaware that the two figures standing on the balcony above them had reshaped the future of their civilization. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of a man who meant exactly what he said. "I did not fight for the empire," he said. "I fought for the woman who wanted peace badly enough to marry a stranger, Silithara, queen of 47 worlds, commander of fleets, daughter of a dynasty that stretched back millennia, had a response prepared for every possible answer he could have given: a political response, a diplomatic response, a royal response. She had no response for that, so she did something she had never done before. She reached out, took his hand, and simply stood beside him in the silence. His fingers were warm and rough and scarred, and they closed around hers with a gentleness that made her chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. They stood together on that balcony for a long time, watching the twin moons rise over a city that was still healing, in a galaxy that was still learning how to be at peace. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The silence between them was not empty, it was full. Full of everything they had survived, everything they had built, and everything they were only beginning to become. Across the stars, the story of Ethan Cole spread in the way that true stories always do, slowly, stubbornly, and without permission. It was told in barracks and in classrooms, in diplomatic halls and in the cramped quarters of workers on distant colony worlds. It was not the story of a warrior, it was not the story of a conqueror, it was the story of a quiet man who married an alien queen and showed the galaxy what strength really looked like. It was not loud, it did not conquer, it did not boast, it simply refused to let good people fall, and in the end that was enough. That was more than